A diagnostic ultrasound catheter used in that process is sold by the original manufacturer, the medtech industry, for about $2,500. When that device can be reprocessed, that's folks from my company, by the way, coming out to the hospital, collecting the device after the procedure, again, taking it home to our factory. It is registered, it's cleaned, it's tested, it's re-sterilized, and then sent back, and then the cost may be $1,200.
Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about reprocessing, and that is because the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast is all about sharing the tips and tricks and tactics about making healthcare sustainable. It is presented to you by Green Innovation Group. We are a management consultancy that is dedicated to decarbonizing the healthcare sector. Why do we do that? The healthcare sector is responsible for between 5 and 6% of all global emissions, depending on who you ask. Some will even say 4%. No matter how you look at it, it is an emission that is going to increase during the years. It's a sector that is growing quite rapidly. So it is a problem that we do need to solve. And that is why we put together this podcast in order to share all of the findings, all of the insights that we have in our work, but that we just cannot make time to go and distribute to our clients only. So that's the focus of this podcast, and we do hope that you are going to enjoy listening to this episode. It is all about reprocessing, and that is a topic that has come up on quite a few occasions. We also produced a white paper a couple of years ago called the Business Case for a Circular MedTech Sector, where one of the things we're looking at is the potential to take spent medical devices and take them apart, clean them, and put them back into the market so they can serve more patients. And overall, from an environmental circular economy perspective, that makes a lot of sense. From an economic perspective, it makes a lot of sense. However, the healthcare sector is a very complex beast, and therefore there's a lot of obstacles connected and associated to reprocessing or remanufacturing, as it's also called. So that's why we have called in Lars to be with us in this episode and to explain the ins and outs of the reprocessing industry. So first of all, welcome to the show, Lars, and thank you so much for taking part in this episode.
Thank you, Frederik. Appreciate it.
So Lars, the reason why we got to talk was that you found the podcast and we exchanged a few ideas and we talked about reprocessing and remanufacturing, and the way we work with it is mostly on sort of on an R&D side, because we have clients in the medtech sector that are curious about how can they adopt going away from single-use items and into multiple-use items, or into something that can be refurbished or remanufactured. But we also see that for a lot of companies, it's just having a host of challenges because they have built an entire organizational infrastructure that does not allow for them to reprocess and to remanufacture. But on the other side of things, we do see that it, from sort of a circular economy standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to produce something for it to be used one time only. So we do need to figure out a solution to this. And that's why I was really excited when you reached out to me to discuss remanufacturing and reprocessing. So for those of our listeners that are not familiar with the term, I would love for you to elaborate on it. But I also think we owe them to get a chance to get to know you. So maybe first of all, Lars, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up working with reprocessing?
Absolutely, and thanks again, Frederik. My name is Lars Thording. I hail from Denmark, as do you, Frederik. So I immigrated to the United States about 25 years ago in pursuit of my academic career. Spent my first career in academics, became a branding consultant for biotech and pharmaceutical companies in the United States, and ended up joining the reprocessing industry as we know it here in the United States. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's terribly hot, about 43 degrees centigrade today. So enjoy those of you that don't have those conditions. Reprocessing is a almost 25-year-old industry in the United States in terms of regulation being in place. It's much younger other places in the world. And just for clarity and to your point, like the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in the United States, has decided to regulate this practice based on the term reprocessing. It is the same as what the European authorities is regulating under the term remanufacturing. So when I say reprocessing, for those of you that are in Europe, that means remanufacturing from a regulatory perspective.
But at the end of the day, there are two sides of the same coin. It's more or less exactly the same thing, like the potato.
It is. It's from a regulatory perspective. It's the idea of enabling companies to collect devices that have been single-use devices that have been used once, take them back to their facilities, reprocess them, re-sterilize them, then sell them back to the hospital for typically half the price. That's being regulated in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, Asia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other places in the world. But it's a much older industry from a regulatory perspective in the United States than elsewhere, which is why I thought it was really fascinating to get to talk with Frederik about this, because I think we have something to give in terms of what are the experiences that we've had. As you were saying, Frederik, it's a complex space because there is a medtech industry that is financially interested in promoting the single-use concept. If I tell the hospital after you've used this once, you have to throw it away, I'll sell more. So there's the financial consequence for medtech of the reprocessing practice. There's also a financial consequence for the hospital in that they can reduce their device cost by about 50%. And there's a consequence for all of us in that we can reduce the massive environmental footprint of healthcare, which you just spoke about in your primer there, Frederik. It's quite substantial. There's already been a few life cycle analysis studies published about reprocessing, and then they show that the environmental footprint of a reprocessed cardiology device, for example, is about half. That's 50% of the carbon emissions footprint of a new device. So it becomes substantial, Frederik.
Yeah. So if we're looking at it that way, I suppose that one of the arguments for the single-use device producers to welcome this with more open arms could probably also be that if it has been remanufactured once, it's not going. Is it possible to remanufacture it again a third time, or would there be a regulatory limit to how many times it can be reprocessed?
It's determined by the regulatory submission. So both in all regions of the world where reprocessing is established in the regulatory system, the reprocessor, my company is called Innovative Health. We reprocess devices in the cardiology space. We look at a device, let's say it's a diagnostic ultrasound catheter. That's a very expensive catheter used in most electrophysiology procedures in cardiology, right?
So if you had to explain that to your 12-year-old neighbor, how would you explain what it is?
Electrophysiology is the study of the electrical parts of the heart, right? One of the most common diseases in cardiology and throughout healthcare really that we treat today is atrial fibrillation. It means that there are electrical misfirings in the heart. It's very, very common and it's growing very, very fast. In electrophysiology, the electrophysiologist will conduct studies by inserting catheters through the groin into the patient's heart, locate where those misfirings are taking place using a diagnostic ultrasound catheter and several other catheters as well, and then put an ablation catheter in and ablate, which means firing or freezing, burning or freezing those misfirings. When such a procedure is successful, a patient does not have atrial fibrillation anymore and is cured, quote unquote. It's an extremely expensive procedure. In the United States, device costs involved in the procedure, and that's before the doctor is paid and the building has been paid for. Device costs for such a procedure are more than $10,000 for one procedure. That's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. A diagnostic ultrasound catheter used in that process is sold by the original manufacturer, the medtech industry, for about $2,500. When that device can be reprocessed, that's folks from my company, by the way, coming out to the hospital, collecting the device after the procedure, again, taking it home to our factory. It is registered, it's cleaned, it's tested, it's re-sterilized, and then sent back, and then the cost may be $1,200. That is done as many times, Frederik, to answer your question, as we have proven to the regulatory authorities that it can be safely reprocessed. So, so I can submit an application to, in my case, the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, and say, here's my data. I can safely reprocess it one time, or I can say, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this. I think it can be reused 3 times, and I submit data for that, and that then is what the regulatory authorities are approving or not approving.
Okay. Is that public knowledge, how many times it can be reprocessed?
It is. So the documents, redacted documents from these submissions are public domain information, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. How many times are the devices reprocessed typically, or?
So that depends a lot, and I'm going to take it one step back, because the mindset around devices should only be used once lies deep in healthcare. We have this sense that the more you throw away, the safer the conditions for the patients are. Right? That's the myth that we're dealing with here. We love throwing away gloves and syringes and stuff like that, but now we're talking about throwing away a $2,500 catheter that was only used once. As a reprocessor, I'm going to look at, is that catheter really so bad, so poorly designed that it can't be reused? And sometimes it is. Other times, the material integrity, the functionality, and so forth are actually so good that it can be safely reused one more time. In other cases, it's 3 more times. In cardiology, we really don't reuse these devices more than 3 times.
Because the risk of failure gets too big.
Yeah. Exactly. We're a super conservative industry when it comes to
safety comes first. I mean, that's the patient safety is one that cannot be compromised. But in cardiology, I mean, I suppose those are also some of the most critical devices. Are they the ones that you probably have some kind of analysis going on where you look at what is the value of the device, of the single-use device, what's the frequency of use in the different procedures in the operating theater, and then looking at it. How many products are you looking at in total? Is it 5 different products or 500, or how many are we looking at?
So we're handling about 1,000 SKUs. That's individual devices, right? But that breaks down to, let's call it 80 different brands of electrophysiology devices. If we break that down further, Frederik, in an atrial fibrillation procedure that we just talked about, 9 or 10 devices are being used fairly consistently.
Yeah.
And again, in total, the math works out to device cost in such a procedure in the United States, where I'm talking from, of more than $10,000. If you reprocess all the devices that can be reprocessed in that procedure, you can reduce those device costs by about $3,500. So you're reducing total device costs from about $1,000, $1,500 to $6,500. Not all devices in such a procedure can be reprocessed. Some of them are just too fragile. Some of them are so complex that if I can't prove that I can clean the device and then inspect it to demonstrate to my regulatory authorities that it's clean and safe, I'm not going to get a clearance to do it.
No, that makes perfect sense. But 1,000 SKUs, that's a lot of different products.
Mhm.
Um, it, are a lot of them just different SKUs because due to slight differences, or are they radically different? Like they would look very discernible from one another. How
Yeah.
close are they?
I mean, once again, if you look at what a device does, it's really only 10 different devices, right? But then you have the
Yeah.
different brands that are being offered. Physicians will have different preferences for brands for using a 60 millimeter one or a 90 millimeter one. So that's the level of detail. But, the easiest and handiest way to look at this is it's really, say, 10 different types of devices used in these procedures. Reprocessors will do everything. As an industry, we do everything to look in these procedures for what can be reprocessed and what can't. But it's certain devices and not others. And we look at things like material. Does the material degrade over usage time? We look at functionality of the device. Do the mechanical pieces of it become tired or lazy during reuse and so forth? And again, determine conservatively when they cannot be reused anymore.
How are you looking at? I know, Lars, from a lot of companies and also hospitals that the shelf life of a medical device, even though it can be really expensive, can be quite short. So that this is something that's put in place to guarantee that when I'm having a surgery, the surgical camera is has not reached an expiry date where we can no longer prove that it's safe to operate with this surgical camera. So what happens to the original expiry date once a product is reprocessed? Does it get an entirely new expiry date, or does it run on the same one as the device had originally? How do you go about that?
That's a great question, Frederik. Look at it this way. When we remanufacture or reprocess a device, from a regulatory standpoint and from a clinical standpoint as well, it is treated exactly like a new device. It's in my case, Innovative Health's liability. We're the ones that the original manufacturer is now out of the picture, and the device comes with its own shelf life. So it's from that perspective like a brand new device.
So it will also say innovative health liability wise. It will no
Yep.
longer say whichever global medtech company it said originally. How do you deal with there's something in Europe, I believe, but also in the States, I believe it's also called physicians preferred items, where the physicians have certain items that a surgeon will only do the surgery with certain items that they are preferring. So it could be one manufacturer that they would only want this one, and then that manufacturer gets a priority in the tendering when they're buying the equipment. Are you then allowed in your own going to market strategy to say this item was originally from company A? So if it's a physician's preferred item to have devices from company A, this is a device originally from company A, but now it's reprocessed, so it's Innovative Health. Does that factor into your own marketing, and how do you go about that?
Yeah, we will. We will always make it clear to the clinician, technologists, and administrators that this is a reprocessed item. But preference card items is an important part of this discussion as well, because look at it this way. It's really hard in hospitals where doctors have strong preferences for certain instruments and devices. It's really hard to introduce environmental and cost savings initiatives that involve demanding that physician change their preferences. That's a major problem, right? So I may have a product that from an environmental perspective is better than another product, but that's not it. I'm going to have to convince the physician who has been trained on this other device, who loves this other device, to switch out their behavior, and that's not easy. Reprocessing is a way of gaining those environmental advantages and cost savings advantages without asking the doctor to change their preferences. Because the Biosense Webster diagnostic ultrasound catheter that is reprocessed is what that guy was trained on, is what he prefers, what he's used to. It has been reprocessed, but it has all the same functionalities, all the same look and feel aspects as the new device. So that, in fact, is something that makes it easier for reprocessing to gain an impact in these labs and hospitals. That it is cost savings without asking for changed behavior.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And if we're looking at single-use medical devices as a whole, what would your estimate be? How large of a percentage might get reprocessed with I think also with profitability in mind? So we're not just looking, potentially I guess it would be 100% almost, but if we're also looking at something that has a sound business case, well, how big a piece of the pie could we actually go out and reprocess? Are we talking 5%, 10, 50, 75%? How large a portion could be reprocessed, do you think?
If we're looking at what has been regulatorily cleared within the United States and in Europe and other places, then mathematically about 75% of devices used in cardiology procedures could be reprocessed. Or there are three things that are the reason why that is not happening. And typically in the United States, maybe it's more like 35, 40%. One reason why it's not 75% that are being reprocessed is that, as we've talked about, there's a limit to how many times they can be reused. If it can be reused one time, every second device I use, I have to buy new.
Yeah.
Right? If it can be reprocessed 3 times, same mathematical logic. So there has to be a constant inflow of new devices into this circular process, similar to other circular economy solutions, right? The other reason why reprocessing has not reached its full potential, if you will, is that there is still resistance among medtech companies against the practice. So they will they're the ones that should be thanked for creating such great devices that they can be reused, but they have put that single-use label on it. And they're not particularly interested in me taking the device, reprocessing it, and selling it back to the hospital at half the price, because now they lost a sale, right? So there's a lot of resistance from the medtech sector against this. I firmly believe, Frederik, that over time, the medtech sector is going to embrace reprocessing because it represents a better value proposition for the hospitals and because it's simply necessary for us to address the massive environmental footprint of medtech.
Yeah, it has really good mission alignment, I think, in the long run, but it might be a tough pill to swallow up front, I think, and the thing about the medtech sector is that it's also a lot of tiny kingdoms. It's a tiny kingdom in the procurement department for a hospital. It's a tiny kingdom for the physician in the operating theater. It's a tiny kingdom for the person in the commercial unit who has the P&L sheet and has to go out and make those sales. So there's a lot of tiny kingdoms that need to agree on something that inherently is very difficult for them to agree on. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we see the kind of resistance that we're seeing, that it's difficult for some of these organizations to be agile enough to go in and say, okay, but now we're just going to shift gears, and instead of being the best in the world at producing the single-use device with very little downtime on our production lines, with a great focus on patient safety and efficiency in our product and having very high degrees of quality, all of a sudden we need to be a reprocessing company as well. I mean, that's a lot to ask for. And there's no one unit besides maybe the sustainability department or some forward-thinking strategy unit that would say, yes, this is the direction we're taking, because all of the investments have been made into the single-use economy. So I think that there's it is going to take a lot of courage and boldness and bravery to get in there for the ones that do the first moves. But I'm curious about when you have those 1,000 different units that you can take in and that you can reprocess and you can send them back. I have two things in mind. The first thing is, do you have to go through the approval process for each of those 1,000 items, or are they bulked on the different device types? That's the one thing. And the other thing is, you keep coming back to this analogy of taking the device from the hospital. Let's say it's a hospital in Arizona. Do you sell the device back to that same hospital, or are you allowed to sell it back to any hospital? How is the sort of the life journey of a certain device?
So let's start on that one, Frederik. The journey of the device again is that I actually place a crash cart, a hospital cart, in the hospital in the cardiology lab. After a procedure, technicians or nurses will take the instruments that we have told them we can reprocess. They'll wipe them down. They'll put them in biohazard plastic bags, put them in the drawers of that cart. Then our collection technologists come out. They collect the devices, prepare them for shipping, ship them to the plant. The device is cleaned, it's tested, it's inspected, it's sterilized, inspected again, packaged, put in finished goods inventory. And I will tell the hospital that I just collected 5 devices from, you can now buy back 5 devices. It's not going to be your own devices. If you want to wait for your own devices, it's going to take 2 weeks, and the hospital is not interested in that. And besides, and I do want to make this point real brief, like the regulatory clearance of a device means that FDA has looked at a lot of data, and I mean a lot of data, and said this reprocessed device is substantially equivalent to the new device, functions the same way, and it involves no added patient risk. That's what a clearance means. So if you believe in the regulatory authorities, you won't care if it's your own device you get back, because the process ensures that it is substantially equivalent to the new device that you just grabbed out of the new pouch before the procedure. About 1,000 SKUs. We have 46 clearances from the Federal Drug Administration. So one clearance is typically for either one brand of a device, which can come in 20 different lengths and little tiny details, right? Or it's for a group of brands that are substantially equivalent and that have the same indication. So good point and good catch. It's not 1,000 clearances.
No, okay. Yeah, because when we're talking about public procurement, one of the things that has gained significant traction actually in public procurement circles is to have LTAs on everything you're buying or that you're purchasing as an organization. And when I look at some of our clients have 100,000 SKUs, and for them to run an LTA on each and every one of those items and then just change maybe the cable, as you said, this one is 6 millimeters instead of 8 millimeters. This one is, I don't know what. That would be an absolutely bonkers exercise to go through for all of the medtech companies, because some of them have so many different line items. So what I'm really curious about is how we can meaningfully bulk some of that work, so we make it more assumption based and make extrapolations where we accept a certain level of confidence in the data, but also know that there are some insecurities in terms of the precision of the data on one side. And then on the other side, I'm also personally a big fan of the healthcare pathway approach, where instead of looking at the environmental impact and the cost of item by item, we're looking at the entire healthcare procedure. So if there are ways where we can cut down the number of procedures for a patient or the number of hospital bed days for a patient, due to using different procedures, different methodologies, different approaches, then that should actually be factored in to the procurement decision rather than the life cycle analysis for that single product, because then, I mean, we might be not even comparing apples and bananas, but apples and pencils, and then it can turn into quite the monkey business exercise, and just the costs of conducting 100,000 LCAs would be probably so high that we could achieve a lot more positive environmental benefits by investing that money somewhere else. Even though the medtech and the pharmaceutical industry are both fairly profitable industries, comparatively the emissions from product by product is not as high as it could be. So I think that it's just important that we as an industry do not approach this with then we just need precise data, ensuring patient safety level precision in the data that we have on the LCAs, because that's not necessarily what is desirable. But how do you look at this from a reprocessing perspective?
Yeah, no, I completely track with you on that one, Frederik. If you only look at LCAs, it's a very limited view you get into the overall environmental impact. And I've made the argument myself before that you need to look at not only product alternatives or procedural alternatives, but also product design, right? The medtech sector makes decisions that have environmental impact when they're saying we're going to use this plastic or that plastic. So it's just not broad enough. I completely agree with you. I put out an article last week that I'll make available for where I actually addressed what you're talking about there. I think number one, at least what we're seeing here in the United States, hospitals are under so much pressure to demonstrate and account for their environmental footprint. And they all have sustainability coordinators, and all those sustainability coordinators have gray hair because they can't get numbers from their suppliers. The suppliers just don't know their environmental footprint. It has to start somewhere, right? So if I have 46 clearances, 1,000 SKUs, 10 different types of products, I'm not going to do 1,000 LCAs. It should still be on me as the supplier, I feel like, to provide reasonable numbers to the hospital. But we're coming from nothing. So any improvement is taking us in the right direction, right? So let me just give you this example. There was an LCA life cycle analysis coming out from a German research institute called Fraunhofer. It was published a couple of years ago. It looked at a reprocessing company in Germany called Vanguard, and it looked at one electrophysiology catheter, one model out of all these different models, right? And it created a LCA study on that, including dimensions of the circularity that is also involved in reprocessing. And it showed that, again, the difference between the carbon footprint of a new device and a reprocessed device is the new device is about twice as high. It's almost 2 pounds of CO2 equivalent in difference. So it's a lot. And it's a lot because these devices are so intricate and uses so many metals and plastics, and the production process just creates a massive environmental footprint. I use 1.94 pounds as a means of looking at what my environmental footprint is and what my environmental footprint is versus the new product. But I make the assumption that what was true for this one device that was tested is true for all the other devices I have as well. And it's close. I can't do 1,000 LCA analyses. I'm making that assumption. I'm also making the assumption that the transportation distance between the hospital and the reprocessor in Germany is the same as mine. I'm also making the assumption that the cleaning process that German reprocessor used involved the same chemicals. I'm also assuming that, frankly, the time the goods sat in final goods inventory where electricity was burning when somebody came in to pick up a product was similar to it. I'm making a lot of assumptions, but I have to. If I want a meaningful discussion, and if I want to help that poor gray-haired sustainability coordinator, I have to make those assumptions. I always make them clear, right? This is an approximation, but we got to start somewhere, is my point.
That's a really strong point. And I think, Lars, that is just about the the most elegant and perfect ending to the conversation that we could ask for. So in summary, reprocessing and remanufacturing has a huge potential. It's called two different things. It is the same depending on whether you're in Europe or you're in the United States. What we're seeing is that it is gaining traction. There's a limit to how many times a certain device can be reprocessed. Typically between 1 and 3 times is what has been deemed safe and approved by the FDA. In the case of Lars and the company Innovative Healthcare, 46 approvals have been made by the FDA on 1,000 different products, where a lot of those products are very similar, but they are different. When we're looking at the life cycle analysis, we still are in very early days of life cycle analysis in medtech devices. So we do have to make a lot of assumptions that are based off of the most recent studies that we have, and then slowly, as we learn about more studies and more granularity in the data, we can start elaborating on it, but currently it's not really possible. The life journey of a reprocessed device is that it's taken from a surgical procedure, it is transported back to a reprocessing facility, where it is then being cleaned, tested, and cleaned again, and that is making sure that it can be sold back to another hospital in the circuit, where that hospital can see around 50% cost saving and see environmental savings in the range of 2 pounds of CO2 equivalents per device, because that's what we know right now. It's as good as it gets. I think that just about sums it up. Lars, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that was an excellent summary.
I learned a lot from this conversation, so thank you so much for making yourself available, for sharing your insights. I'm sure that there's a lot of our listeners that are going to appreciate this. So for all of you out there, thanks a lot for listening to this episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast. Every week we share a new episode. As you know, please do like, share, subscribe to the podcast. Rate us, give us the stars in wherever you listen to your podcast. Last year, we were amongst the top 5% most shared podcasts on Spotify. That's all because you shared with your friends and colleagues. So thanks a lot for that. We really deeply appreciate that. If you have any suggestions for guests that we should bring on the show, I'm very keen to hear that. Also, Joachim will also be listening into that. You can contact us through LinkedIn. We're quite active in there. Once again, my name is Frederik from Deurs. I'm the CEO in Green Innovation Group. You've been listening to an episode of the Sustainable Healthcare Podcast, where we had Lars in the studio, who's an expert on the reprocessing and remanufacturing industry. Thanks a lot for listening.